This is Christine Patterson, and I'm really glad that you can join me today for this interview with Geoff and Jackie Bishop. It's the first time I've actually met them in person, as it were, although it's by Zoom and not in the flesh. Normally we've been communicating by email. They're in Brisbane, Australia, and I'm in Taiwan. They are also, feel as though I know them because of we have a lot of roots in common, which will no doubt come out in this interview. I was born in Burundi, they worked in Burundi, and they're also the parents of Jennifer, who has been a huge help to us. And Jen had an interview with me a few months ago. So anyway, I'm really looking forward to this. They have a lot of post-field experience, and that's of great interest to us because that's one of the main stresses that we want to make on FieldPartner for people who come back from the field, to see how much they still have to contribute. Anyway, so just before we start, I want to say again, this is one of a series of interviews that we have done on FieldPartner, and we'd love you to go and look at any of those interviews on fieldpartner.org. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can listen to it as a podcast as well. And so just please go to FieldPartner and have a look. Like us on Facebook and just follow all the new things that are coming. Right, so with that done, let's start with the interview. And I want to say hi and thank you to Geoff and Jackie. Thank you, both of you, for joining me today. Just start, if you wouldn't mind. I've said where you are, so start by telling us your roots. Where were you both born, and how did you come to faith? And I think you had a bit of background on the field yourself, Geoff, so tell us about that, and then how you got interested, Jackie, in missions. If you could just start there with your roots.
Right. Well, I was born in Brisbane, Australia, into a devout Methodist family. They're associated with Methodism, went way back. But when I was 3.5 years old, my parents volunteered to a Methodist overseas mission post in Samoa, which is in the Pacific, right. Western Samoa. They went as agricultural missionaries. Dad had been in farming and other practical things. And they went there for 4 years with my 3 older siblings. So there's 4 of us children, went along. And Mum, I think my mother found it very hard, particularly with the schooling for us, because there wasn't much in the way of schooling for expats. I did a little bit of schooling there in a local mission-run Samoan school, but we really didn't get much education while we were there. We returned after 4 years in 1954 back to Queensland and moved around a bit until we settled just north of Brisbane and continued in the Methodist church there, where I went to Sunday school and various youth groups. And at that stage, the Methodist church was very evangelical, and these Methodist camps, the youth camps, were a great formative part of my life. I found that a real challenge there was put forward, and I gave my life to Jesus. And a bit later, through Billy Graham crusade, I rededicated my life, and I felt a real sense of the love of God for me. And that stuck with me through the rest of my life.
I was born in Croydon, near London, and parents weren't regular churchgoers. But when my older sister was 5 and they decided she needed to go to Sunday school, they sent her to a lively Anglican church in the next street. And by the time I was old enough to go to Sunday school, our whole family was involved in that church. And it was there that I heard all the major Bible stories and learnt about the love of Jesus, that he died for me, for my sin, and that I could have eternal life. When I was 11, I joined Girl Crusaders with a friend. This was a interdenominational Bible class. And I began to learn more about what it was to be a disciple of Jesus. And we had a lot of mission input. We'd had some in Sunday school. I remember in primary Sunday school, they had mission boxes on the table once a month, and I always put my money in the little African hut box. And in Crusaders, we supported different missionaries, we prayed for them, and on camps, we always had a missionary on camp for 2 weeks. And so I had a lot of exposure. And then at 15, we moved to Kent, and our town was very monocultural, except maybe for a few French or Italian students in the summer. But my older sister went to Salisbury Teacher Training College, and in the holidays, she would bring home African students who couldn't go to their home country. And one of those was Enid Sabiti. Her father, Erica, was at the time the Archbishop of Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi. And I always felt a real attraction toward African people and got to really know and enjoy those young students coming to stay with us.
After that, you went to university. So Geoff, you did engineering, right? And your first job was in mining in the Northern Territories. Did you have any idea that you would do anything else apart from that at that stage?
Well, when I got into the degree in mining, I went in without any clear idea or calling or desire to do mining, but it sounded interesting to me. I was interested in geology, and I thought, oh, well, that sounds good. I didn't have any clear future prospect of I was going to stay in mining all my life or anything like that. But I went to Tennant Creek in Central Australia, which is not too far north of Alice Springs, right out in the middle of nowhere. And I worked there for nearly 2 years, 20 months. And I enjoyed the practical side of it. I loved the hands-on rock mining that we did there. But after about 15 months, they started to put me into the office to train me up as a proper mining engineer. And of course, that for me wasn't what I wanted at all. I didn't see myself as a management person at all. I rather wanted the hands-on side of things. And so it wasn't too long after that that I resigned and decided then that I was, having saved up quite a bit of money working in Tennant Creek, that I would travel, do the usual Australian thing of travelling around. So I decided I was going to head off. And I decided, because I thought, well, maybe I'm going to be away for quite a while, I'd go and see my parents. Now, my parents had been living near Brisbane, but had moved to New Zealand because my younger brother had got an apprenticeship with relatives in New Zealand. So they'd gone there to support them, and they'd sold up in Australia and bought a house in New Zealand. So I went to live with them. Now, while I'd been in Tennant Creek, I got pretty dry spiritually. There wasn't a lot of fellowship there, and I didn't nourish myself spiritually. When I went to New Zealand, my parents were involved in a very lively charismatic church in Wellington. Mm-hmm. And of course, I went along, and I was very blessed with the baptism of the Holy Spirit, and it really changed my motivation. Didn't change me from wanting to travel, but so I went to UK, but I went with a different motivation. I went wanting to serve the Lord. And I had still a vague idea that maybe I would end up in Africa, but no clear leading on that. So I went and spent a year in England. Now, I'll say a bit more about that later.
Okay. Now, I noticed from the bio that you sent me that there were 3 strands of connection with members of my family. Now, but the first 2 were with you, I think, Jackie. So I'm trying to get the chronology right. You left school and then you went into teacher training in North London. And you credit my mum with planting a seed that led to a significant change of direction for you. So can you tell us about that?
Yes, I went to teacher training college and I joined the Christian Union. And the first year, your mum, Elizabeth, came as a speaker. And she was in Rwanda. I'm ashamed to say I'd never heard of it and didn't know where it was. And she just spoke to us all and challenged us. Would we be willing to go maybe and teach in Africa? And that, because of missions input, and my heart was open to that possibility. I felt a seed was planted. And I remember the following Sunday going to the church I was attending, standing up to sing and looking at the pew in front of me. And there were a pile of magazines and it said Rwanda Notes, Rwanda CMS Notes.
Right.
And from then on, it seemed to be Rwanda Mission came before me a little. And then that seed grew over the next 5 years because I finished my training. I taught in Kent. And then I went to Mount Hermon Missionary Training College in Ealing for a year. And I was assigned to a church where your sister Meg was worshipping, and she was a police officer.
Right.
And of course, a name like Gilbo, you say, oh, Gilbo. And then the second year, we amalgamated with 2 other colleges and went to All Nations in Hertfordshire for our second year of study. And it was during that year that I was accepted as a candidate for Rwanda Mission. After that, I had French immersion for almost 9 months.
Where?
I had
Brussels or where?
I went to Paris for 2 months to the Alliance Française, and then to Switzerland to the Institut Emmaus, but I was going daily to a language school in Lausanne.
Okay.
And I had very good French at school for O-level, but I really hadn't taught much at all. And so this was an opportunity for me. And I'd been assigned a school at Kigeme in Rwanda to be a teacher there. But during that time of French, in Switzerland, there were a group of us, and the civil war in Burundi erupted, and we were praying almost daily for Burundi. And I felt one day a real sense in my heart that maybe I would go to Burundi.
Oh, wow.
And then I had a letter from the mission in London saying, we have a request for a teacher to go to Burundi. We know you've been assigned to Kigeme, but we're wondering if you would pray about it. And I knew straight away that God had already was directing me, and I was able to say, yes, I'm willing to go.
Great. So you went to Burundi and to a place called Buhiga, is that right?
Yes, indeed.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to come to the third connection with my family in a minute. But first of all, Geoff, you meanwhile were still on the other side of the world at that point, were you? And you hadn't yet come to the UK?
Well, I went to UK in 1972. Ended up in Burundi in 1974. I had a year in England where I travelled, and then through a friend that I met in Tennant Creek, ended up going to Stanmore Baptist Church, which is quite a big Baptist church in North London. But the big thing was that they were very close connections with Tearfund. The minister was even on the board of Tearfund. And I had started, after my travels, started to think about what next, and started to look around to see what would open up. I had tried with SIM, maybe to work in Africa, but they knocked me back because of my charismatic experience. And then I found a connection with Tearfund, and they said, yeah, we've got something for you. You can do a short-term building project in Burundi. And it's just sitting there waiting for you to get there. And this, with of course, with the Anglican Church in Burundi. And so in preparation, they said, well, quick, learn some French. Fortunately, I had learned some in high school, but not much. And so I got some cassette tapes and studied up as much as I could. And then I spent about 2 months, I forget exactly how much, at Hawkesbury, which was a CMS residential college house, where they assessed me, you know. So they looked at me and decided I wasn't too much of a risk to be sending out to the mission field. That was the only formal training I had. I didn't do any study. Yeah, they were very keen to get me out there quickly as possible. And so I ended up going in early 74 to Burundi.
Okay.
And that's where I met up with your Rosemary. But at least even though they were in a hurry to get them started, they let me do a 3-month Burundi introduction course with Rosemary.
Okay.
And there was a few others of it, including Graham White and Ursula Parry and a couple of others, thereabouts anyway. Excuse me. And that was a great foundation for me to get me started. So then I ended up at Buhiga to do this building project. And behind the hospital building project, or beyond the hospital building project, there was a much bigger project funded by German churches to build up the local secondary school. And that involved dormitories and assembly hall and kitchen and a lot of work. And before too long, I was totally involved in doing that. And I had a lot of help in Burundi with Harold Aidney. He was the senior doctor at Buhiga, and so he helped me a lot with interpreting and getting me started. And after a couple of years, I was on my own, so I was able to talk Burundi to my workmen. Yeah, I think that's about it, isn't it? Yeah.
Right, but there you met each other, right? In Buhiga? I mean, were you thrown together because you were the only two singles, or how did that all come about?
Yeah, I didn't go looking for romance. I didn't go expecting to meet the love of my life or anything like that. And there were other single people on the mission station, other single ladies, that is. But after a while, it became clear that Jackie and I had something very much in common, and we started to get interested in each other. And of course, then it was a challenge to have a relationship without having a relationship, if you know what I mean. Fortunately, the missionaries were very understanding and were able to go away to Matana, which is another mission station, where we stayed separately, of course, with missionaries there and had a time away together. And that was very good for us. Harold Aidney, the senior doctor, he was a great father figure for me. He advised me that, yes, this is a good idea, go for it. I was encouraged by him. Yeah.
Great. So where did you get married then? Actually in Burundi, or did you go back to get married?
We got married in Burundi in 1970. So we're coming up 46 years. Yeah. And in fact, we had a civil wedding on 6th of June, which is just 2 days ago. And in the capital, and that's what's written on our marriage certificate, is that date. But our actual church wedding, which we had in the Buhiga church, was on the 9th of August. So we count that as our wedding date.
Right, nice. So where did you have the civil wedding? Sorry, I didn't catch that.
In Bujumbura, in the capital of Burundi.
Oh, okay.
We went to the government offices there and signed the papers and did that sort of thing.
The reason we had to have it 2 months before was because the man who was going to marry us, we thought, just shortly before our August wedding, he was going overseas and he wasn't coming back until after our church wedding. So we went early, and I just asked for time off from school, and we said because we're foreigners, we had some official things to do. We had an African pastor and Pat Brooks, who was one of our missionaries. They came as our witnesses, and we were given a little book with a place for the names of 12 children in it by the registrar. And he said, now he said, you can take me for a drink. And we said, oh, we're actually going off to have an ice cream. And then we went back to Buhiga and lived our single lives again until the August wedding, when I was very blessed because my parents came out from England. Lovely. But they were the family on either side who were there. Mm-hmm. We just felt to go to England, it would have been my wedding if we'd gone to Australia, which we wouldn't have done. It would have been Geoff's wedding. Had all our African and missionary friends and family there with us.
And your parents came.
My parents. Yeah. Going back when we met, I'd actually had a broken engagement in the past, so I was extremely wary of another relationship, and so it definitely wasn't love at first sight. But as I began to relax and get to know Geoff and appreciate him, then I think love blossomed. The Tier and CMS were both very encouraging of us, and things I think we had similarities in our family background. We had our call to Africa and our faith. The adjustments weren't too significant, really. I mean, amazingly. My schoolgirls were very intrigued and interested by it all. But we had to, be very careful culturally to be. And I remember if we had a gathering and Geoff would walk back to my little house, the night guard would come out with his spear and stand behind me and wait to see me go into my house and say goodnight to Geoff. So off Geoff would go. So, yeah, I mean, young people today would think how extraordinary, but I think God is very good.
Lovely. Tell us about Burundi itself in those days. Everyone's heard about the genocide in Rwanda, but you just mentioned the troubles that started in Burundi just a short while before Rwanda, right? Well, no, yeah, there were a lot of troubles that coming out at various stages, but so there'd been a genocide in 1972 before either of you arrived there. So, what did you experience in the aftermath? In Rwanda, there was a definite move of the Holy Spirit at about that same time. So did that sort of affect Burundi at all or not?
Well, when I arrived in 73, I think everyone in the school, the community, the church had suffered in some way from that genocide. And the missionaries shared with me stories of schoolgirls and church members and the things that they've been through. It was all very sad. I remember being outside one day playing volleyball with the girls very happily, and an army truck went up the road and they just all stopped and stood and looked. And I realized that this was a memory from the war. But
we were aware of the underlying tension still from that time. And it was a tangible thing. When you left the country, you'd almost feel a weight lifting off you. You had to be careful not to mention Tutsi and Hutu. That's the two tribal groups that clashed. And be careful, what you said in public. But on the whole, it was going, the Christian side of things was going well. They had a fairly good Christian union in the school, and it was reasonably strong, but we felt it was very skin deep. A lot of it was like posturing. They were very good at standing up and saying the right words, but you didn't feel it was really gone down into their hearts. But the Spirit came upon them at one stage. I remember it very clearly because I was outside the church, I don't know why, sitting, and the Christian Union was meeting inside the church. And suddenly they were fleeing from the church. They ran out, some of them, not all of them, but some of them did. They had sensed a real presence of the Holy Spirit in the church, and it had scared them, so much so that they ran out. It was quite amazing. But from that, we saw a real change in some of their hearts. We felt a real genuine deep change that meant people were bringing back things they'd stolen. They were actually doing things which showed that they had properly repented, you know. And that was a great experience.
That's amazing. So you have 3 kids, but only Jen, the middle one, was born in Burundi. Where were the other 2 born?
Well, we had leave every 3 years with CMS. And so Rebecca was born on our first leave. And then Jen was born in Burundi. And then on our second leave, we had Ian. And the Africans were quite excited. They'd say, you came 1, went back 2, came back 3, went back 4, came back 1. They thought we were going to go on and on doing that. Didn't quite work like it.
Right. But ultimately, it was the issue of education that caused you to leave. So that's always one of the biggest challenges that missionaries have to face. And there's no blueprint. It's one thing that seems to be very clear, that everybody has to make their own choice and decide differently. So why did you make that choice to leave at that point?
Yeah, well, there were other things happening in the background. The government was starting to clamp down on giving visas to missionaries. They were starting to they were sending home quite a few missionaries who they felt weren't doing anything useful for the country. They wanted people who would bring in money, who would do projects that were prestigious and brought in lots of money. And so at that stage, they were sifting through and sending home missionaries. A couple from Rwanda Mission weren't able to renew their visas and they had to go home. Quite a few Americans did. And so my project at that stage had come to an end, and we just felt it was a good time to move on.
Right.
And so we were peaceful about leaving at that stage.
Okay. And so where did you go then? Did you go to the UK, to Australia? What happened next?
Well, we really talked about it and jointly decided that Australia was the place to go for our children's sake. And Jackie's parents were very good about that because they knew that all their grandchildren that they had were now moving to Australia. So they were very kind, you might say, in letting us go. So we moved to Australia. That was in the end of 1984.
Okay. So, and where did you settle then? You went straight back to Brisbane, or where did you go?
We moved to Toowoomba, where we are now, because my mother had ended up moving into Toowoomba. My father had died in 1978 from cancer, and the church that they were in had very kindly helped Mum find a house in Toowoomba, a nice little house that she could live in, and she'd moved into Toowoomba. So we felt it was a great place to come and be with her, at least initially, until we settled down.
Okay. So clearly, both of you, though, had a real impact in your lives by living in another culture. And I understand that you carried on expressing a real heart for the nations. So what do you feel the impact was then of having lived and lived life in another culture? How did that impact you when it came to seeing people from other cultures in Australia?
Well, for me, I had been doing some very satisfying projects. There was a hydro power plant we put in, and that took 5 years of our time. And coming back to Australia, suddenly I was a very small cog in a big wheel instead of being the other way around. And that took me a while to adjust to, really, quite honestly. It took me a couple of years to really adjust back to just being a normal bloke in workforce in Australia. But yeah, we still had a heart for missions, and we met up with a couple who had been missionaries in the Congo. They lived just around the corner from us, and we really sort of latched on to them because they had shared experiences that we could share, and we found a real sort of bond with them. They helped us, and I suppose we helped them a bit, but yeah, they took us under their wing and got us back on our feet, you might say, in a sense. Yeah.
Yes, and they, Ken was actually the assistant pastor of the church we went to, and there was a good emphasis on mission in that church. There was also an international fellowship with mostly students from our local university. We became involved in that, and many of them were from Asia and from the Pacific Islands. And after a few years of living in Toowoomba, we moved to a bigger house, and we started to have a boarder every year. We had boarders from various countries over the following years, which was great for our children to have that exposure. And one of them, a student from Zimbabwe, who'd had quite a remarkable life of difficulty and had a scholarship to come to Australia, but that had fallen through, and she came to live with us, and finally she's become part of our family because she has no one left now in Zimbabwe. And so I think our experience in Africa helped us to identify with people who'd come to study, people who'd come as immigrants. And then more latterly, our city started to welcome Sudanese refugees, Congolese refugees, amongst whom there were Burundi from the camps, the same camps as the Congolese. And we met one family where the husband had taught in the Ruhiga Secondary School, where I had taught, but obviously many years later, they were living in Toowoomba. And more recently, we have Syrian, Iraqi, and Yazidi refugees, and many of them have suffered terribly. And I think just experience with the genocide and the suffering helps us to understand a little bit of how it's been for them. And now they're in Australia. And I think if you've never been anywhere, never lived in another culture or had to use another language, it's easy to think, why don't people just speak English and live like us?
Right.
So they need lots of care and support and help. And there are great things going on in our city, particularly for refugees.
So job-wise then, were you went back into engineering work, did you, Geoff, or and you into teaching, or what did you do?
I started locally in engineering, but it was very much more like a labourer in the engineering firm. So it wasn't very highly paid and not very satisfying. So I ended up transitioning sideways into teaching, into secondary teaching. I did study, 1 year postgraduate study, and became a secondary maths and science teacher. And that's what I did from then on, up until I retired. And that allowed us to stay in Toowoomba, where we still are living.
Okay. And so, Jack, you did teaching too, right? Yeah.
I was teaching, yeah, mostly part-time. But in 2003, we had long service leave, which is a wonderful thing in Australia. After 10 years, you get 10 weeks of paid leave. So we went back to Burundi for 7 weeks, and we wondered if God would open up something for us to be there, to work again. But it just did not become apparent that there was anything specific for us. And so we went back home, and the following year, an opportunity came for us to go and work in China through the Department of Education in Queensland. Had a partnership with a Chinese company preparing Chinese students to come to university in Australia. And we taught in this program for 1 year in Nanjing, and then a couple of years in Longfong City, which is in Hebei province, not far from Beijing. Okay. And it was a good experience for us. And none of the students actually wanted to come to Toowoomba. They thought of it as a sleepy little place, although we've got about 130,000 people here. They wanted to go to the big smoke, to the big cities of Brisbane and Melbourne and so on. Right. So we didn't really keep in touch with a lot of them, but we have met Chinese in Toowoomba and Chinese at the local university here.
And in our house, we have, since we settled in Toowoomba, we've got a fairly big house, and after our children mostly moved out, we were able to host boarders who'd come to Toowoomba to study English. And so we met a lot of people from Malaysia, Korea, China, Japan, and we had boarders on and off like that, homestay people who wanted to improve their English. We've had them on and off ever since then, right up until COVID put a stop to everything like that.
Right. They're short term, maybe 2 weeks, 4 weeks, maximum 8 weeks, okay. Either school or part of their university. So that's been really, really enjoyable.
Mm. And that obviously rubbed off on your kids, because Jen also got involved with international side of church and things like that. And she obviously has the nations on her heart too. That's lovely. So what would you say to people who don't feel called to go abroad but still have the nations on their heart? How can they engage like you have with international people at home? And what special skills or mindset is needed for that, would you say?
Well, I think we, for example, got a CELTA qualification, which is an English as a second language qualification, and that sort of thing. And then get into helping migrants learn English. That's what I've been doing. I've been teaching ESL at a local church that holds a Saturday 2-hour English course. And these people are mainly migrants who've come, refugees. At the moment, they're mainly Yazidi from Syria and Iraq. And that's a great point of contact, because they desperately want to learn English so they can get work. And they're open to the gospel. Of course, they've had a Muslim background, most of them, although the Yazidi have a different religious background again. But it's a great point of contact with them. And other things we've done, like I went on a high school trip to the Solomon Islands as a missions outreach, because the school I ended up teaching in was a Christian school, and we had interest in overseas, and so I helped with that trip. We went to the Solomon Islands and travelled around and ministered in a couple of the local churches there. That was a fascinating time. It was great for me, because it was like going back to my roots when I was very young and we were in Samoa. Right. It was a bit of nostalgia for me. Yeah.
Right, but it sounds like a lot of the people that you have met would, in their home environment, would be very hard to reach. But when they have come out of their, for whatever reasons, as refugees or just to study, they're much more open, I would say. Is that so? Have you found that to be the case?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely, yeah.
And I think just friendship and hospitality is really important when they're away from their own countries, especially with students. Yeah. We have a group I am part of called Sisters, which is an inter-church friendship group. We meet every month, and it's for immigrant refugee women. And we do all sorts of activities, including little English segments and games and cooking and eating together. Even we're just starting to eat again with COVID. But yes, and that they come and go. So usually we have a lot come when they first arrive, and then many of them will find their own groups and interests. But we have some who, Congolese particularly, who've been with us for many years, and they still love coming. In fact, I met a lady in the supermarket yesterday, a lady I know, Josephine, and she introduced me to another Congolese lady who'd never been to Sisters, and we were saying we'll invite you next time for our next meeting. So that was lovely. I don't know whether...
I was just going to say, through our local church that we're involved in now, I'm the leader of the local missions coordination group, and we try to encourage people to be interested in mission. It's sometimes feels like an uphill battle, but our church supports a missionary overseas and several others who are local, and we pray regularly each Sunday for a missionary, and that's a good thing in our church. And I just keep on trying to raise awareness of missions.
So just one last question. At FieldPartner, one of our main burdens is to inspire people who've been on the field to see what a huge contribution they still have to make. I mean, obviously, I didn't actually ask you about this, but you have the re-entry stress, you know, the difficulty of settling back in. You mentioned difficult, you know, becoming a small fish in a big pond, and, you know, finding your way again when you get back. So I think that's a process that everyone goes through. But then after that, to still realize how much you still have to give in the kind of stuff that you've been talking about. So, I mean, how would you feel you could encourage people who've been on the field to re-engage or keep engaged with reaching out to international people, and seeing how they could even have a part to play in mentoring people who are preparing to go? Have you any thoughts about that?
That's all true. I think one of the things is when you come back, local Christians, as much as they might want to be friends and so forth, don't understand what you've been through. You can't share that. And yet we've got a doctor family who's just come back from PNG. They had a pretty tough time and they're pretty burnt out. And we felt we could listen and share and empathize with them and help them in that area. They're coming through very well, and we feel that they'll be good. But they're great because they've got a young family. They've got 5 children with another one on the way. They're great to have ministering in our Sunday school, sort of, you know, here these kids have been overseas and they're just sort of raising a bit of interest and awareness in missions overseas. Yeah.
Great.
And last weekend we had a church away, and Geoff got talking to a young couple who are very interested in mission, and we're going to go and see them on Thursday evening, and they want to share what they're hoping to do. And so it's just keeping an ear to the ground, I think, and getting involved. I don't know whether I could mention domestic mission or whether that's not really on the agenda.
Of course, yeah.
One of the amazing opportunities we have in Queensland is that the law allows volunteers from local churches to go into schools and teach the Bible. And we're involved in RI in our local schools. And I find that the children who know the most about the Bible are the African refugee children, the Filipino children, and the Islander children, and the Australian children, for whom probably that's the only time in their week that they hear anything about the love of God and about God's wonderful rescue plan. So there are opportunities like that in our increasingly secular society that we can take up and, you know, go and bring good news to those around us. And children are remarkably open, and it is one of the highlights, I think, of the week, really, and just an amazing opportunity that's still open. In some states, that door has been shut completely.
Many other places. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful. I mean, I think that the breadth of what you have been through and the way that you've continued to sow into international people wherever you've come across them just shows the breadth of God's work in our lives. Even when we sort of leave the field, there's still so much more that he has for us. So thank you very much for sharing. And we really appreciate getting to meet you and to have
Thank you for inviting us. Thank you.
Okay.
Right.
So, well, goodbye to you two then. And I just want to say goodbye to everyone else. Thank you very much for joining us. And do, as I said, please go over to fieldpartner.org and see what there is on the website. Listen to all these interviews from the YouTube channel or the podcast. And you can also see us on Facebook and like us there. We'd really appreciate that. Okay, lots of love then, and join me next time. Bye-bye. God bless.
Bye.